Well, let's get more on the significance of this 6-month mark and where the war could go from here. We're joined by John Lyndon. He is the Executive Director at Alliance for Middle East Peace. Hello, John. Now, 6 months on, how have international opinions shifted on the Hamas attacks as well as the Israeli response in a way that could impact the trajectory of the war?
I mean, I think it's unrecognizable if you cast your mind back to 6 months ago, to the way the world initially reacted to the devastating attacks that Hamas deployed on Israeli communities in the south of the country. You saw wall-to-wall, very wide solidarity and support for the state of Israel. You know, the Israeli flag projected onto buildings around the world, strong condemnation, including from Arab states like the UAE and the Saudi Arabia against Hamas's actions. And I think over the last 6 months, the picture has transformed. Part of this is due to, I think, the unprecedented level of destruction, particularly in the early phase of the war. It's important to note that in the first 5 or 6 weeks of this war, around half of the reported casualties occurred. So we saw levels of destruction, particularly in the north of Gaza, which shocked the world. And it must be noted, we're not visible to most Israelis. I was in Israel recently, and those scenes are just not in the Israeli media. So we saw the perception of Israelis, Palestinians, and the international world depart very, very quickly in different directions. And, you know, there's this Hemingway quote about how one goes bankrupt. It's gradually at first and then suddenly. And that's kind of what's happened with regards to international support for the war. And in the last few weeks, particularly this week, I think we've seen a sea change following the killing of the 7 workers from the World Central Kitchen. And of course, the conversation you alluded to earlier between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden, which seems to have elicited very quick changes with regards to provision of humanitarian goods and access in Gaza. And now, as we see, the removal of a division from the south of the Gaza Strip.
Yes, and you talked about alluded to the international criticism that Israel is facing, even that court case that's sitting at the ICJ at the moment. How then does Israel balance this increasingly difficult international relations and not being seen to be breaking international law with the ability to still defend itself against attacks?
Well, I think what we've seen is the culmination and the failure of a strategy that had been in place for a very long time around the idea that this conflict could be managed. And it's very much associated with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that entire concept collapsed on October 7th. And the international condemnation, the isolation that we're seeing growing, I mean, these are really significant structural challenges to Israel and its place in the region and the wider world. And I think the most obvious, direct and sort of effective way to address that is an entirely changed direction towards conflict resolution rather than management, to show the world very sincerely that Israel is moving toward trying to resolve its 7-decade-long dispute now between it as a state and the Palestinian people. And I think the world, if they sense that that's really happening and that there's a real turn in direction, the response will change as well. And ultimately, that's where Israeli security will be delivered and guaranteed via diplomacy, not by any military operation.
Well, might Israel be funneled in that direction given the domestic situation now? Because we see Netanyahu encountering a melding of 2 very unhappy groups, the families of the hostages taken by Hamas, as well as those looking for him to step down and calling for early elections. Might that be one way of approaching what you are suggesting? And how do you see Netanyahu navigating this?
I mean, it's important to note that in a poll, I think in January, 15% of Israelis said that they wanted Netanyahu to be prime minister after this war. So I think there will likely be changes taking place. And he's a very skilled political operator. He'll hang on as long as he can, obviously. But you mentioned those protests. Israel has a vibrant, very dynamic civil society. The families of hostages, many of whom that I'm in touch with, larger networks of NGOs like those that are members of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. I think the change that we're talking about to really push politicians to move towards peace and diplomacy, because we're not hearing that from very many members of Knesset, really from the centre to the right. That change can come from the bottom up. It can come from civil society, come from activism, educating and advocating for peace and making the case to fellow citizens. It's the only way to stop recurrence of events like we've seen over the last 6 months.
Interesting. Well, 6 months ago, you did answer the question on where you saw the war heading, and you warned back then that the on-the-ground deteriorating, as well as a wider regional escalation, being the prelude to something more serious. Well, in revisiting that question, where do you see the war heading from here today? And even further down the road, where does this leave the two-state solution?
Well, what I hope, and actually I'm increasingly cautiously optimistic about, is that we're moving to the final phase and the end of this war. And I think everybody's thoughts need to be with the negotiations taking place in Cairo for a ceasefire and hostage release deal that can really catalyse that next phase, where we stop focusing on the day-to-day and the horrific events and instead look in that longer term of what we're trying to achieve diplomatically. And that's where I think a renewed push towards final status diplomacy needs to be the non-negotiable position of the entire international community. But it's really important that we don't repeat the failures of previous diplomatic rounds. The stakes are just too high now. First of all, it needs to be much more multilateral. The US, Europeans, Arab states, the wider world, treating this as a big geopolitical issue that needs to be solved multilaterally, where everyone's influence is brought to bear. But secondly, it needs to not just be elite driven and top down. You know, we have great examples in places like Colombia and Northern Ireland of how a bottom up strategy in synthesis with final status diplomacy can generate far greater outcomes than we've ever seen in Israel-Palestine. In Northern Ireland, we spent $44 per person, the world did, every year for 2 decades to generate civic support for peace. In Israel-Palestine, we spend about $1.50 to $2 per person per year. So the difference is enormous. And I'd love to see, for example, we have a G7 leaders summit coming up soon in Italy. The international community be very clear that we are going towards final status diplomacy. We're not stopping until it's over. And we are radically scaling and being in solidarity with the work of civil society on the ground, Palestinians and Israelis working together for peace, equality, and security. And that bottom-up pressure can really change the political dynamics and incentives in both societies too.
John, appreciate that interesting, important insights at this 6-month milestone. John Lyndon there, Executive Director at Alliance for Middle East Peace. Thank you.